Welcome back. This is the final lecture of 5 videos on Of Mice and Men as we track through the entire novella. So, is Of Mice and Men a fatalistic novel? Does it always tend towards a tragic conclusion? Well, it seems to me that it does. The book's setting, George and Lennie's circumstances, the wider social landscape, they all render them destined for disappointment. So, what hints, obvious and subtle, does Steinbeck give us? The world of 1930s America is not conducive to success and prosperity. So the idea of a dream for anybody, woman, person of colour, disabled person, nomadic worker, anybody, is hopeless. To illustrate this, you could say that Steinbeck draws on the biblical idea of the fool. He does this to show how the context and circumstances of each character's life mean that their failure is kind of inevitable. The fool describes the moment that Adam and Eve in the Genesis story disobeyed God's command, "You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." This is sometimes known as original sin, because ever after we will unavoidably sin. There were 2 trees in the Garden of Eden, though. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life gave Adam and Eve access to eternal life. When they chose to reject God, they were cast out into the world, the wilderness, and everything that comes with it: pain, suffering, isolation, chaos, and mortality. They would one day die. And God curses them in lots of ways, but the main one is to deny them access to this tree of life. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. So from this point on, humankind cannot escape suffering and death. The Christian idea is that Jesus provides a way for humans to gain access to the tree of life once again. He pays for people's sin, so that they can exist in a perfect world with the perfect God. But Steinbeck uses allusions to the Old Testament to demonstrate how the circumstances of 1930s America mean that people like George, Lennie, Crooks, Candy, and Curly's wife will never attain paradise. They're caught in a sort of cycle of death, decay, and disappointment. Even on a structural level, this is obvious. The book ends in the same place that it begins, so the fate of these characters is inescapable. Look at this diagram. I called the first of these videos a corrupted Eden, because Steinbeck shows us that due to the corruptive influence of the world, like the displacement of people, large-scale unemployment, sexism, racism, natural disaster, the list goes on. Because of those things, the hope of a better future, a prosperous and secure future, is futile, because tragedy is kind of inevitable. Steinbeck creates a version of paradise in California. It's lush and green and fertile, but the entire novel seems to follow this downward trajectory, in which any signs of those great qualities around the life box head unstoppably towards the qualities around the death box. The title for today's video is A Motionless Heron. Why? Because at the beginning of the novella, Steinbeck describes a stilted heron labouring up into the air and pounding down river. Notice how Steinbeck basically describes the heron twice in the same way, laboured and stilted. It's as if he really wants to emphasise that this heron is finding flying very hard work. This is a brutal world, one in which men and animals alike have to struggle and toil. God curses Adam in Genesis by saying, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life." Life's hard, and Steinbeck shows us this in so many ways in the opening setting description. You should look for patterns in language and imagery, search for ways Steinbeck hints at the hardship of life. But you might be thinking, that heron isn't motionless, and you're absolutely right. It is later, though. Here is the section that mentions the heron in the final part of the novella. A water snake glided smoothly up the pool, twisting its periscope head from side to side, and it swam the length of the pool and came to the legs of a motionless heron that stood in the shallows. A silent head and beak lanced down and plucked it out by the head, and the beak swallowed the little snake while its tail waved frantically. A far rush of wind sounded, and a gust drove through the tops of the trees like a wave. The sycamore leaves turned up their silver sides, The brown, dry leaves on the ground scudded a few feet, and row on row of tiny wind waves flowed up the pool's green surface. As quickly as it had come, the wind died, and the clearing was quiet again. The heron stood in the shallows, motionless and waiting. Another little water snake swam up the pool, turning its periscope head from side to side. The snake is arguably another allusion to the Garden of Eden, where the serpent represents Satan, luring the unsuspecting Adam and Eve into temptation. But here the snake is killed by the heron. Is this a sign of the world's brutality, the predatory nature of existence? At this time in America, if you wanted to get anywhere, you had to be ruthless. Curly knows this, and so he compensates for his height by training to become a champion boxer. Steinbeck doesn't just describe this killing in strictly biological terms either. No, he looks to evoke emotion in the reader. It's a little snake, and its tail waved frantically. The idea of death, its awful dominance in our lives, is deeply embedded into the setting. The imagery itself cries of suffering, even in how the wind died. Look for patterns in the language. Remember how Curly's wife is described when Lennie kills her? She struggled violently under his hands. Steinbeck wants to replicate his message in the language, the structure, the characters, the form, even the sound sometimes. The heron is motionless because our lives can be plucked away without any warning. We are at the mercy of tall threats that stand in the shallows, lurking motionless, ready to ruin our lives. Think of the poem To a Mouse by Robert Burns. The unsuspecting little mouse whose home is ruined by the plough, towering over his pitifully constructed nest. Steinbeck initially wanted to call the novella Something That Happened. I guess the heron represents this. It eats the snake and another one comes along. Do you see the sort of cyclical nature of just this description? Forget about the novel as a whole, but think about this description. We have at the start motionless heron and a snake twisting its periscope head from side to side. And then we've got, again, after this little interaction in which the heron kills the snake, a motionless heron and another snake comes up into the pool. And so it's like this sort of this image of a heron and a snake, the surrounding environment and the setting, the animals, they almost represent what's happening in the novel as a whole. And I guess the novel as a whole represents what's happening in America as a whole. And Steinbeck initially wanted to call the novella Something That Happened. And so if we think that the heron represents this, it eats the snake and another one comes along. The death of the first is already part of its history, a forgotten and insignificant moment in the past, much like the characters in the novel. The brown, dry leaves, too, are a sign of the seasons. Those leaves are gone and new ones will grow, and those leaves will die and new ones will grow, and those leaves will die and new ones will grow, and on and on and on. The wind as well is like a wave. The moon in its cycle, the tides, it comes round month on month, year on year, and there is no stopping it, because it's a force beyond the control of pitiful, pathetic human beings. We see this idea replicated on a character level too. Here's a list of all the major relationships within the story. What happens to each of them? One half dies, leaving the other half to wander in isolation. The motionless heron is perhaps symbolic of the overarching threat in the novel as a whole. There are risks and dangers out there that make Eden, paradise, unattainable. The best laid plans and all that. We should understand the world for what it is, Steinbeck tells us. This allegorical tale, this kind of parable, says that reality is a lot more brutal than we like to believe. In fact, failure is inevitable.